This is critical thinking on the axial skeleton lab, and let's look at the questions. So here is a question on a vertebra, and this is on the thoracic cage, and here is a question on the skull. Now let's go to this first one, and which first asks you to identify the bones seen here, and then which bones does it articulate with. So first of all, you know that this is a vertebra because you can see that this area here is the spinous process, or the spine of the vertebra. This area here is what is known as the lamina. What you can't see here is this part here is the transverse process, and actually it will have a little foramen here, which is the foramen transversarium, because this is a cervical vertebra. And then here is a facet for articulation with the vertebra above. And then in this, the special feature is this pointed structure which you see here, which is known as the dens. Now let's say you didn't know that that was the dens. You must know the differences between the atypical vertebrae. So let's first look at the choices we have and come to the right conclusion. So it says here the first thoracic vertebra. Now by looking at it, even let's say you forgot that this thoracic vertebrae were very different. They didn't have this protuberance here. They had costal facets. They had the body of the vertebra is very typical, which looks like this. It goes across like this, and this is the spinous process, and here is the vertebral foramen, and they have costal facets up here on the transverse process. So let's say even if you forgot that, you cannot tell the difference between the first and the second and the third vertebra. So you don't know. By just looking at this picture, you can't tell that it is the first. It could well be the fourth. So therefore, apart from the fact that it does not have features of the thoracic vertebra, it can't be this one. Then this one here, patella. This we are doing the axial skeleton, so therefore it cannot belong to this axial patella does not belong to the axial skeleton, so that is wrong. And in any case, let's say this was a question which came on the test. The patella does not have a foramen inside here, like a huge aperture here, so therefore that is also wrong. Then let's look at lumbar vertebra, again for the same reasons, because if it's the first lumbar vertebra, it would be a typical vertebra, but the first and the second, the third look very, very similar, so you can't tell the difference. Plus they have a body, and then the transverse process, and then of course the spinous process, and then here is the vertebral foramen. Now you can barely see the body, instead you see this protuberance. So a lumbar vertebra too does not have that, so it's not the lumbar vertebra. So let's look at these two choices where you know that cervical vertebrae, the first two cervical vertebrae are atypical. They're very different from the rest of the vertebrae, and you can and should be able to recognize them. So let's see if this is the atlas. Now the atlas is a ring-shaped cervical vertebra, so it does not have a body. So it has a huge ring like this, and then you have the transverse process where you have the foramen transversarium. So that's the transverse process, the foramen transversarium with a little tubercle, and then it has condyles here where it will articulate with the occipital bone above, and then below also there'll be condyles to articulate with the second cervical vertebra. So this is not ring shaped, hence it's not the atlas. Now let's look at this one, axis. Yes, it is, because axis is a cervical vertebra, the second cervical vertebra, which is very, very typical because it has this raised portion on the top, which is known as the dens. It's the only vertebra in all of the vertebral bodies which has this. So therefore, yes, it is the axis. And then it asks you, what does it articulate with? So because it's the second cervical vertebra, it will articulate with the first cervical above, and below it will articulate with the third cervical. So the first cervical is the atlas, so it articulates with the atlas and the third cervical vertebra. So therefore this is the answer to this question. So whenever you're looking at a bone, you must also know what it articulates with, and obviously it will articulate with bones which are close by. So this question kind of gives you an indication on how you should study bones. Here I've used vertebra as an example, but when you do the appendicular skeleton, again, if you think of bones there, you will similarly be asked about bones and what they articulate with. So your knowledge should be complete.